Dobrý večer, vítejte na inspiračním fóru. Já teď budu mluvit anglicky. Hello and good evening on the inspirační forum at Ji.hlava. My name is Jonáš Zbořil. This is our guest, Icelandic writer, poet, essay writer, author of all good books and theater plays. And his name is Andri Snær Magnason. Good evening.
Good evening, nice to meet you. Pleasure to be here.
I'm really happy Andri is here because he just flew here from Washington, D.C. Am I right? Is that right?
Yes, yes, yes.
So we're really glad that he had time to visit us. And I want to tell you something about our program and why we're here. We're going to talk about some stuff that's not really, that's pretty heavy weight, pretty sad, and pretty hard to grasp. Our topic is melting glaciers and also the limits of our imagination and coming to terms with climate change and the possible end of the world as we know it. Why can't we come to terms with it? Why can't we really talk about it? What's the problem with the language when we want to talk about it? That's some of the things, these are some of the things that we want to discuss here. For the program, we have about 90 minutes to discuss this topic. We will start with Andri's spoken word on it with some lecture presentation. Then we'll have an interview and there'll be time for your questions. And yes, I want to say something more about Andri before I let him speak. Just briefly, Andri was born in 1973. He wrote so many different genres in Icelandic literature. He made some children's literature. He wrote drama plays. He wrote books of essays. And there were two books translated into Czech. One is called Time Box, Truhla času, which is a children's book. The other is called On Time and Water, which is a very, very interesting essay. Maybe it's also, you could also call it a novel in some sort because it's full of, it's a one big story that talks about a melting glacier in Iceland, but it also talks about glaciers in India, and it talks about our ancestors, but also our future children and what we're giving them. So that book is translated into Czech. You can also get it, read it. You can borrow it if you want and look through it. It was also translated into Slovakian. So if you love absinthe, publishing house, you can get it in Slovakian language. Okay, Andri, now is your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe I'll just stand up because I have some images. It's great to see you. I actually recognize some faces in the audience. I had a great round trip around Czech and Slovakia last summer. So the book that I'm talking about is called On Time and Water. And the reason it's called On Time and Water is that I met a climate scientist in Potsdam, and he asked me, why don't you write about climate change? And I said, like, I'm not a scientist, I don't have authority, it's not my field. You know, you should write about this. My father, he's a doctor, he hates it when normal people are giving medical advice, like eat more avocado. He would spit his morning coffee, like reading stupid articles about health. So I'm not supposed to go into other people's fields. But he said, I'm making data every day, I'm making science, but people don't understand data or science, they understand stories. And if my data is not woven into stories, then actually it will never become, and if you don't feel comfortable to talk about my findings and interpret that in your personal way, then the world will basically end. quite dramatic, but so the only way a new paradigm and new science actually travels to the public is through stories. And he said, imagine if only political scientists would talk about human rights, or specialists in feminist theory would talk about women's rights, but not the people on the street understanding the rights and understanding them in their own way. So I started to think about this, and I started to read the science, and I found out that in a strange way, the issue is larger than language. So I can say a sentence, for example. In the year 2100, we expect the pH level of the world oceans to drop from 8.1 to 7.7, and this is the greatest change in the world oceans for 50 million years. So I said this. Would you have cried if I said 7.4 in the pH scale? So in a strange way, almost all the words that I said are meaningless culturally. 2100 is culturally meaningless because 1970 was 30 years ago, and 2050 is after 50 years, and so we're not connected to the century actually culturally. I think it can be made as a theory almost, that we don't feel connected to 2100. The pH level is abstract. Nobody understands how 0.1 is a huge number when it comes to nature and the ocean, and 50 million years is out of all proportions. But it means that a single human being born today, becoming as old as my mother, is seeing a bigger change in the oceans than not only all my ancestors or all our ancestors, if Homo sapiens is 300,000 years old, or the Homo species if we are 5 million years old, but 10 times the evolution of humanity is acting upon a single life of a single human being. So that is not only history, it's basically mythology. It's geology, it's mythology. It's nature leaving geological speed and entering human speed. And that is also a paradigm shift. That it means so much more than most information that we could get from science. So I was thinking, how can you write about something? Because you can't use the words. And the metaphor that I used was the black hole. That is, you can't really look straight at the black hole. The only way to understand the black hole is looking at the periphery, at the neighboring stars and galaxies. And then you can understand the black hole. So in a strange way, to understand the future, it was easier to understand. I had to understand time in general. So I was thinking about kind of my first encounters with time when I was working in the Manuscript Institute in Iceland, and I was putting on display every morning this manuscript here, which is the primal source of Nordic mythology. And this is the Poetic Edda. This is where almost everything we know about Odin, Thor, Valhalla, basically this worldview of the Nordic gods, the world of the Nordic gods, is preserved. And this is something that Marvel Comics has been mining for the last decade or so. And these stories can be seen now in mega Hollywood, but also in Wagner, in Tolkien, in modern dance, in Norwegian heavy metal. The influence is in so many places. And I was kind of starstruck when I was 23, putting this manuscript on display every day. And I was thinking, how can you write something, because I wanted to be a poet, how can you write something that inspires somebody after 800 years? Because this text is readable to Icelanders. You can see the big D here. Deyr fé deyja frændur deyr sjálfurðið sama, en orðstýr deyr aldrei hveim sér góðan getur. It means your family will die, you will die, your cattle will die, but your reputation will never die. So, actually the sentence was proving itself, because this sentence is not dead. And I was thinking, how can you decide to preserve something for 800 years? How can we plan to preserve this document until, 2800? And how has the Earth changed more in the life of this single document than in the previous 100 years than in the 700 years before that. So I was in this institution, and I was kind of torn at the time because my uncle had invited me to be elsewhere. He had invited me to come to the Amazon to help him to do primal research on the mating habits of the anaconda snake, which was also quite exciting for a 23-year-old. And even though this seems exciting, it was actually quite boring because I was among very old scholars, and I was indoors, and nobody came to the exhibition because they were so bad at marketing that I was alone with the manuscripts. And I was constantly thinking that I should be in the Amazon with my uncle John Thorbjarnarsson, because help him to the research of the mating habits of the anaconda, and then to go to Brazil, where he was doing research on preservation of the caiman crocodile. But he was also kind of connected to time, because after 50 million years in existence, this strongest, most vicious beast on Earth was about 21 of 23 species were kind of on the brink of endangered or extinction. So I wanted to be there, but I was expecting my own crocodile. And it wasn't kind of the first thing you do when you expect a child. But this, again, was an encounter with time, because having a child is kind of science fiction. You're throwing a process into the future, and you must, when you're having sex, you're probably thinking of 2050, when the consequences of that is still out there. So the responsibility of having a child and the future and the planet and everything was kind of occupying my mind, and I was then inspired by the basement of this institution, because they had 5,000 hours of recordings, because Iceland was very isolated for like 1,000 years. Not until the 20th century we started to get proper connection to the outside world. So we had families that were preserving memories in oral tradition that could be traced down to medieval times. So folklorists in the 20th century were traveling around Iceland, and they were recording old ladies that were singing lullabies that they learned from their grandmothers, that they learned from their grandmothers, that they learned from their grandmothers. And I was putting these headphones on my head every day while I was nursing my child, and it sounded something like this. Is there sound on the system? That's the sound. I will do this again. I will go here. This was supposed to be a surprise.
Bárður Björgúlfsson, Björgúlfur Hringsson, Hringur Hreiðarsson, Hreiðar Garðsson, Garður Gunnarsson, Gunnar Refsson, Refur Ráðfinnsson, Ráðfinnur Kollsson.
This goes on for an hour. And I was kind of mesmerized by this. This woman had never performed this for anybody but her children. And she learned it from her mother or her grandmother that was born 1820, that learned it from her grandmother that was born 1850. And I was thinking what I actually had around me, and I didn't notice, because you noticed in these archives how something goes from being common and popular to becoming rare, to becoming unique, to becoming just so precious that a folklorist is driving 100 kilometers an hour to an elderly home because this one last old lady remembers a fragment of a song. And I was thinking of my own grandparents, because I had a full set until I was quite in my late 30s, actually. I had 2 grandmothers and 3 grandfathers. And I was thinking, whatever I would record from their life would be something that my children and grandchildren would see as very valuable. Just like my grandmother telling me about how she was 8 years old, sent to another part of Iceland to babysit. I was like an 8-year-old sent to another half of Iceland to babysit, and she came back when she was 14 years old. I was like, this is so short, what was happening. My grandfather that lost his father, but started working when he was 10, but he loved photography and filming, and he bought a camera for his first payment. And he was used at the annual sports games to evaluate who won the race, because he could snap a picture, run home, develop the film, and come back, and they could see who actually won the race, something we take for granted today. So I was going through his archives, and I was thinking, wow, this is so unique and special. And I was thinking of how they were witnessing basically the big changes of the 20th century, and what it meant to be a girl that wanted to do the same things as her brothers were doing, and how my grandmother had to kind of break through the norms and insist that she could do the same things that her brothers were doing, and how we take that for granted today, but what it actually means to have known that first woman in the whole history that was doing this. And they were founding partners of the Icelandic Glacial Research Society, so I could talk to them about what it meant when the glaciers of Iceland were unexplored and undocumented and unnamed. Actually, they didn't have the glacier had a name, but most of the places and mountains didn't have names. So they were traveling these glaciers. They were stuck in a tent for 3 days in a 3-week journey, and I asked them, "Weren't you cold?" And they said, "Cold. We were just married." And I didn't understand how you get warm when you get married. And so I was just randomly documenting these things, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with it, just during the last 20 years, just recording on old cameras and collecting the photos. And then I spoke to my other grandfather that actually left my grandmother to move to America, where he became surgeon in the New York hospital. And one of his patients was this character here, Oppenheimer. And I was starstruck because I thought I would not become older than 15 because of Oppenheimer's invention. I was quite sure that we would all be evaporated in an explosion. So I asked my grandfather, "Did you see anything special?" Because Oppenheimer is basically not like a king or a famous person. He's basically a mythological character. He changed the balance between humans and nature and gave leaders the superpower to destroy the planet. And because Prometheus went into to the highest mountain and came down with fire and gave that to humans, but Oppenheimer went into the smallest material, came out with something bigger than a volcano, and created fire gods out of the leaders of the world. So I asked my grandfather, "Did you see anything special when he was on the operating table?" And he said he was exactly like the image of Christ in his childhood church in the West Fjords of Iceland. And I went to the West Fjords and I found that Christ, and he wasn't so far off actually. But both of these characters are symbols of time, because I'm born 1,973 years after Christ, but I'm born 28 years after the Trinity explosion, which many geologists consider the starting point of the Anthropocene. That is when formally the status of humans against the planet is totally different from in any era before. That is humans as a geological force. So so something was 2,000 years ago, or maybe it was only about 77 years ago. So I was just randomly collecting these things, and I was using them in my writing, and I was documenting how my grandfather was raised on this farm in North Iceland, like the last generation that was living there for 1,000 years. And I was just randomly looking at all these things, and I was thinking of mythology, what it means to be born on a planet, actually. And because mythology didn't prepare us to live on a planet. So I wrote this book here, which is The Story of the Blue Planet, that is an attempt to kind of explore what it actually means to live on a planet where you do something on this side of the planet that influences the other side that you can't actually see. So this story was kind of my first kind of with poetry and things, and I was just on this role to become a fantasy or a poet or something. But society kind of influences you, and suddenly the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world was endangered. And this was around the year 2000. We were going to flood this area and destroy this greatest nesting place. And I was thinking, like, how can we destroy the nesting ground of a whole species? And I felt like anything that I could write would be insignificant towards what was going to happen there in the highlands of Iceland. And I kind of became very occupied with this and the issue of dams and rivers and how they were selling off the rivers in Iceland to heavy industry for the lowest energy prices. So because one aluminum smelter uses energy like 1 million people. So the government around the year 2000 had plans basically to sell all the rivers in Iceland to heavy industry. And I was kind of devastated. It was almost like Paris wanted to make souvenirs out of the Notre Dame or something. It was like they were taking something special, you could say holy, but that was the thing. You could not say holy. And I was interested when we were trying to defend the areas. I could not say it was important for the animals. I could not say it was beautiful. I could not say it was the animals had the right to live there or it had a special value in itself. But I could only frame it within kind of the language of business. I could say this could be good for the brand of Iceland. This could attract tourists. We could make a national park and we could have lots of buses and hotels and stuff. This could be a good place for a car commercial or the film industry. I had to prove it in some way, or I had to prove this produces some kind of value, economic value for humans. But I could not just say, oh, I'm sorry, this is holy. This has been here for 10,000 years, and we don't have the right to destroy this. And I was thinking I was almost feeling like we were living in a regime, because then I could read poetry of people going through the same area, and they could say it was holy like 100 years ago, but why could I not say that? Not that I'm saying that we have to be spiritual or something. I was just wondering, why did I have to frame everything in these economic terms? And I was thinking of language and how we are maybe not so free to speak, and what it means to be in a paradigm shift, what it means to talk. And because in the old sagas, or in the time of the old poets around the year 1000, they were restricted in their poetic language. They did not say heaven, they said the dwarf's helmet. They did not say earth, they said the bride of Odin, because it was not considered cool in poetry to name things as they were. They were always referred to in the context of Nordic mythology. So then they became Christian around the year 1000. And how do you talk about the creator of heaven and earth when language forces you to talk about the creator of the dwarf's helmet and the bride of Odin? So they could not explain the new religion without having the legacy of all the old worldview in their luggage. It shows that it took about 100 years to understand this, just like Copernicus. It took like a century for his ideas to be understood. We can also see in the Icelandic language, when the idea of democracy was introduced to us, which I always thought you are born to want. You know, I'm born to want my rights to vote. I'm born to want the system that I'm living in. But in 1809, we have an excellent example of, because we were under the King of Denmark for 600 years, and we have an excellent example of how in 1809, the concept of the French Revolution was introduced to us for the first time. And people were like, okay, so the rich and powerful are supposed to have an equal share as the common and poor people. And we're going to have an assembly and a constitution, yeah. And so we're going to make, they are going to choose a king. No, it's not a king. It's a leader that you choose. And if you don't feel like having him a leader anymore, then you choose another leader. Okay, so we're going to have a not king. and his son does not become a not king. No. So when you feel like having another person in charge, then you just choose another person. So the common people, like these that can hardly read or write, they're supposed to choose some person, and then they choose another person, and then they choose another. This will never work. This is nonsense. So the person that introduced this to not King Iceland, to bring us democracy, we didn't have the term prime minister or any of these terms. We just called him Jörgen, the king of the dog days. So it took 100 years for this to be understood, and it took, and even after, and at the same time, women got the right to vote. And you can see that just in the life of my grandmother, how, again, when you change a paradigm, you go against the language. So, fæddur in Icelandic is born as a man, but fædd without the is born as a woman. So when she got her flight certificate, they had to mark out the because they didn't expect a woman to want to fly. So a very subtle kind of manifestation of the biggest kind of revolution that of the 20th century. So after women had been voting for 60 years, we had the women's strike in Iceland, and at that time there were 3 women in the parliament of like 60 parliament members. So after 60 years, we had 3 women in the parliament. And after 100 years, finally, we had an equal parliament of men and women. So again, 100 years. So why am I going through this lengthy thing? And yesterday we had the women's strike again, where 100,000 women came to celebrate and demand the rest of the rights that we haven't found, because there are a few things that we have to deal with still. But Max Planck said a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So I'm raised kind of in the ideologies of capitalism and communism as the dominant worldviews of the world, or ruling ideologies. So that's Höfði, where Reagan and Gorbachev met and marked the end of the Soviet era. And this is Kaupthing Bank. It was the 3rd biggest bankruptcy in capitalist history. And I thought it's extremely interesting that I had not reached my 40s, and I had seen the collapse of these huge ideologies. So I was lying in this bush over there, and I was wondering what's next, because both of these ideologies were maybe not funneled by the power of the ideology, but the power of coal, oil, gas that enabled these empires to emerge. And because they forgot this minor thing, that this was happening within a very delicate balance of our planet, we have new words coming out. And these words are as new to us as the word democracy was in 1809. So this word here, ocean acidification, was first mentioned in Icelandic newspapers in 2006. It was once mentioned in 2006, once 2007, never 2008, the banks were crashing, we were occupied, and twice 2009. And ocean acidification, it is the biggest word in the world, because it's about a process of nature leaving geological speed, entering human speed, a collapse of the pH level of the world oceans. And only this graph here that comes from scientists is a paradigm shift. It means everything that we've done during the last 100 years is wrongly calculated. In good intentions, we built up empires and industries and habits and dreams, but suddenly we find out, oh, sorry, it's not possible anymore. And this data, with, of course, glacial data and other data, confronts everything. So the question is, as a writer, you feel like you almost have the obligation to take a word like this and weave it into your stories, because if we don't understand this word, we don't change accordingly to it, and suddenly you go from being a writer that might be just creating fantasy or entertainment into feeling that you have a duty that is even larger than that, of helping science or helping us to understand the words, because we don't have 100 years to understand this word, because if we understand it only after the consequences are met, then that is quite too late. So the issue of language, poetry, science, word, mythology is something that we're going to talk about now.
Thank you very much, Andri, for that lecture. I had so many questions going through my mind that I got lost, and I thought I wouldn't know how to start. But I want to start with one thing that you didn't mention, and I know that it's the beginning of not your story, but the story of the book that we've mentioned here, which is called On Time and Water. And I think it's important to know the backstory of the book, because it'll tell you more about our imaginations, limits of our imagination, and stuff like that. Because you have a first-hand experience with it, and with climate change, and I think that us Czechs don't really, not yet. So the book started with you and a melting glacier, because you were asked to write a eulogy for a melting glacier in Iceland. In its short version, it's called Ok. Is that the right name?
Ok Glacier, yes.
Ok Glacier. And you were asked to write a eulogy for it. I want to read it first before I let you talk, because I think it's really nice what you said, although very depressing. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening, and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. The last sentence is meant for your daughters, their daughters, and everyone else after that.
Yes, so that was a special assignment. It actually came when I was almost finished with the book. So this was in 2019. Anthropologists in Texas, they asked me to write an eulogy for this first glacier Iceland loses to climate change. And I was like, that's a very strange situation, because glaciers are supposed to be above and beyond us. It's not something you're supposed to live to witness a collapse of. And Ok Glacier, and the thought process was like super long, actually, because Ok, it of course has the ironic name of okay, and not being okay anymore. But Ok actually means yoke. I'm not sure what that means in Czech, like something, an oppression. But it also means, but that is derived from the yoke that carries water, the beam that carries water. So Ok means yoke, so Ok used to carry the water, but it has lost that water to the sea, which is becoming the yoke of future generations. But Ok is also the zygote, that is the first cell of a sperm and an egg. Like the first fertilized cell is the zygote, and the zygote contains all the DNA of the future being. So again, ironically, the Ok cell or the Ok zygote contains the DNA of the future of basically all the glaciers on the planet, and in the next 100-200 years. So writing the plaque, I went through, should I write a medieval stanza poem? How do I address people after 200 years? I was thinking of cemeteries that you visit, that you can read about somebody that was alive 500 years ago. So I was thinking, somebody will stumble upon this maybe after 500 years. maybe after 10,000 years, I was also thinking of the probes that you sent to space with messages for future or other civilizations. So, but in the end, I just came up with this very simple conclusion. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it, which is talking to us and talking to them and reminding us of the responsibility that we have actually here and now. We know what is happening. We know what needs to be done. And are we doing it?
I mean, you say we know what is happening, we know what needs to be done, but I'm pretty sure that there's the problem is right there. Do we really know what is happening? Is that you yourself was talking about, you were talking about how difficult it is for us to understand, to really understand. There's a book called Ani na to nemyslet, I don't even think about it, by George Marshall, which is about climate change, but it's not really about climate change. It's about why we can't really think about climate change and why we don't want to think about it. It's a really good book that was also published in Czech, in a Czech publishing house called Host. So I really highly recommend reading it. And one of the things he says, George Marshall says about climate change and the way we think about it is that it's really similar to death. You were talking about black hole as a way to think about climate change. He talks about death. In terms of the reason why he compares it to death is he says we all know about death, but it still is a taboo. We know everything about it. At the same time, we don't know nothing about it. If you woke up thinking about it every day, you'd be paralyzed by it. If you knew if you really knew how, like, what's going to happen to you, you'd probably be paralyzed. So you try not to think about it. You just go away from it.
Yes, so I think we have, it's interesting actually that we feel like we are oversaturated with discussion of climate change. We feel like we are hearing it every day, almost in the media, but still we have some kind of herd immunity to it. So it doesn't really affect us anymore. And my idea was it was vital to renew the language and actually there was so much fundamentally wrong in how we think we're writing about it. So when I asked my friends, when I told my friends I'm going to write about climate change, they were like, oh, here he goes again. And I was thinking, like, why is it not worthy? Why were they not saying, like, Andri, write about climate change? But why were they feeling like it was a boring issue? And then when I said I'm writing about time and water, then they were like, wow, that's interesting. What do you mean? Well, in the next 100 years, every element of water is simultaneously going out of balance. Glaciers going down, sea level going up, the pH level going out of all proportions, rain, snow, moisture, floods, droughts, hurricanes, all water-related elements. It's just all simultaneously being derailed. And my friends were like, whoa, that's serious. And I was like, yes, it's sometimes called climate change. So this idea that we understand it, but we don't understand it. So in the book, I'm kind of deliberately kind of pushing and pulling. So like, you have to acknowledge first that we don't understand 2100. I could ask you, do you understand 2100? But then you have to say, no, you don't understand it. So when a graph like I was showing you with 2100, most people feel it's just, okay, it's out there, it's sci-fi, it's Blade Runner, it's Hunger Games, it doesn't relate to me. So I used like almost just really the most simple methods of storytelling. So I take my daughter to visit my grandmother, And my grandmother almost became 98 years old, and my grandfather also, actually. So I had access to 100 years of memory, and I could ask these 100 years, are 100 years a long time or a short time? And they both told me, it's like this. It's over before you know it. I feel like I was in the West Fjords, swimming in the fjord last year, said my grandfather. My grandmother was like, I feel like I was traveling the glacier yesterday, but I really want to do it again, but my knees won't let me. So then I go to my grandmother's house, and we calculate with my daughter, she was 12 at the time, when do you become as old as grandmother? And she does the calculation, and she's like, whoa, 2104. And we're like, imagine you might be sitting in this same kitchen, and you will be under the influence of grandmother, which was born 1924. So in 2104, you will have memories of this, and maybe a 20-year-old comes to visit, somebody born around 2080, 24-year-old, somebody that you've not only just briefly met, but somebody you've deeply influenced. Maybe somebody comes for pancakes, and when is that person remembering you as her greatest influence in life? If she becomes 90, and she does the calculation, it's like 2170. So my grandmother whispers a secret to my daughter, something I will never know, something from the 1930s. I hope it's a sweet secret. I don't know. And my daughter promises to tell nobody until 2100, and make that person promise to keep the secret until 2170. So in 2018, when we did this experiment, we could decide something would happen in the year 2170 without writing it down. So the idea, because our time is the time of the people that we know and love, the time that creates us, and then the time that we will know and love, the time that we create, the time we're responsible for. So my daughter, she will be able to, hopefully, touch 250 years with her bare hands, the handshake of generations. So the idea is that it's by telling this story first before I go into science, then I can tell you 2100 is not beyond your imagination. 2100 is only halfway in your inner kind of, in the core of your continuity of love and relationships. So if you decided the sci-fi of having children, you must wonder about 2100 and pay some responsibility in your life. It's not only about having sex and releasing somebody into the world, but it's also about taking responsibility of this world and connecting deeply to this future. So I call it pancake sci-fi. It doesn't matter what kind of technology or gimmicks are going around, just as long as you can go and sit with your grandmother or grandchildren and have pancakes and share your life stories and be human, then things worked out.
Is the problem language, or is it ideology? Because a lot of the changes in language happened because of ideology, or because of like shared knowledge or shared opinions about life and what's right for it. So are we limited in the way we operate within a language, or is it really a problem of ideology?
I think it's when you're talking about climate change, the answer is almost always yes, because it's so big that it is ideology, it is our core understanding, and it's this fact that it is actually normal, if you look at the history of paradigm shifts, that there is resilience in systems, and you don't change like overnight with new information. So it is normal that the velocity of a system that you're living in doesn't stop overnight. So I'm not presenting a new ideology, but it's often easier just instead of saying, oh, it's capitalism or it's common, presenting a new system, it's easier just to frame it in, for example, in law. So is it legal to cause harm to somebody? It's normally not legal. So if I, for example, take a piano and put it out of a window of a high-rise and drop it to the street, I can't claim that I didn't know that gravity was going to bring the piano on somebody's head. I would say, like, I didn't do it. Gravity just took the piano down there and on somebody's head. That would be a stupid argument. But what we are doing is just in a bit longer time lapse of throwing a piano on the head of a whole generation. Yeah. And so this generation is just coming into law school now. This former future, we were always talking about future generations. The future generation is now like 20 years old. So they are coming now into law schools, and they're just looking at the data and they're like, you're taking money for me, my first payments into a pension fund. I'm supposed to get this pension in the year 2070. But everything you're doing currently is expecting 2070 to be a total mess. So almost the whole system that we're living in needs to be rethought and reevaluated, and we have hardly started. So for example, I ask people sometimes, do you believe Corona was a crisis? They say yes, but do you think it was bigger than climate change? They say, no, of course not. Climate change is much better. Then I ask, like, okay, how did your life change over a weekend because of Corona? And people can just name endless, really difficult, annoying things, sacrifices in terms of work opportunity, intimacy. It's just enormous sacrifices that the whole globe made for Corona. And then you ask, okay, because climate change is bigger, just name me the top 10 things that are annoying for how you're responding to climate change. Just the top 10. They're like, yeah, I'm coming. Yep, start. And people are like, yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, just tell me, like, from the first IPCC report to the 6th report, like how dramatically your life has been changing. Yeah, I'm thinking. I don't have plastic straws anymore. Okay, that's dramatic. But it's not like not hugging your grandmother for a year. It's not close to that. Yeah, and my sister, she's vegan. Yeah, but she's not forced to be vegan. She likes it more. She's like, it's intolerable to be with her, and she's always preaching this. It's not like somebody made her do it. It's on her free will. Okay, my uncle, he bought a Tesla. I'm like, okay, so that's the greatest sacrifice you can find of a generation that was really fighting the existential crisis by upgrading to the coolest vehicle he has had. So it's quite obvious that we haven't even pressured ourselves in terms of like doing like the lowest hanging fruit of inconvenience. And I'm not, yeah.
But I'm thinking the problem is we tend to be looking outside on the glaciers, on the graphs, we're pointing at the scientists, asking them for, asking them questions, demanding answers and stuff like that. But we don't talk enough about us as humans and what we do. Like I said, the cognitive dissonance that happens with us. The way we talk about death, the way we talk about and think about things that are bigger than us. It seems like we can't do it. Isn't it time to like look inwards and think about why are we limited in our imagination? Like what? Because when you talk about climate change, I also think about my wallet and how by the end of the month it's always empty, and I always say to myself, next month I'm gonna be wiser with my money and I'm not gonna use it all on beer, and I always do it. And I know that, yes, within 3 weeks you will be angry, you'll be mad at yourself because you know you did it again, and you know you shouldn't do it because you're hungry after that. So why can't I be? I mean, there's plenty of people who are really good at this, I presume, who are really good with their money, who are really good with thinking about, within like 3 weeks' time. But I think it's the same, it's just a different ratio, but the same problem, isn't it?
Well, it's understandable that most of us have enough with our day-to-day struggles. And, and the majority of people are, just trying to do their thing and just try to make ends meet. And it's very simplistic just to think that, again, over a weekend, we will just stop doing all the things that are harmful. But the problem, of course, the challenge is, and maybe the big quest is this beyond our capacity to deal with? And is it just our fate that we will just run off that cliff because we just aren't made to think in this scale? And I often think about like future mythology. How does future mythology look like? Because this is a mythological event. Because Moses, he split the Red Sea 3,000 years ago, and is still remembered today. But the Red Sea is only like 16 kilometers across. Maybe the path was 300 meters wide, 300 meters deep, give or take 1 cubic kilometer he was pushing around, and still remembered today. If the global sea levels rise by 1 meter, that is like 300,000 cubic kilometers of water. And we have among us now the first generation of human leaders that are anthropogenic leaders. That is, before you could have all sorts of wars, all sorts of religions, all sorts of things, but the seasons would continue. The seasons would continue, the cycles would continue, grass would grow over the battlefield, and you will be forgotten, and history will take down your castles. But now we have the first leaders among us, elected leaders, most of them, or many of them, that are actually discussing how they are melting glaciers. And that's a reality that humans have never dealt with. And then, as a writer, you can be in this absurd situation as a writer in the Anthropocene. That why did you write the book? Yes, I am writing the book because I am hoping to give something into the discourse with many others, of course, that will eventually prevent the glaciers from melting. So I'm writing text in relation to glaciers and sea level, which is almost like magic or something. Yeah. But that is the fact that the written word, the law, is in correlation with sea level, and that correlation has never existed before in human history. So it is, yes, so that's why it's kind of natural to go to mythology, because future mythology will look back, like we look at Moses 3,000 years later. Somebody will look back after 3,000 years and they were like, wow, there were humans on the peak of their existence. They were the masters of the universe. They were planning to go to Mars. They had satellites going all around the planet, mapping, measuring everything. They had towers of data and scientists and great minds and computers that could process infinite amounts of knowledge, and they had these machines that were kind of like slaves that could fly with them all over and drive them all over and fetch the food, and basically they could just live a very good life, at least most or many of them. And then they found out suddenly that their superpowers had a problem, that the power in their machines was going to basically take the future of their children. So the people so then the question is now, can we realign these machines so they serve our long-term future, or do the machines live their own life? So are we in no control over the machines? Is it so that when we make a machine or make a factory or make a system, the system has its own life and we actually don't control the system just keeps on going? And that's the big question now. Are we a tragic generation that cannot realign the system, or are we a generation that can take this data, realign the system, and create some kind of a path into the future that seems sane?
Yeah, I mean, that was my question. If we talk about the lack of imagination, do we talk about the lack of imagination in ending what we do now, in ending the system, or do we lack the imagination when we talk about the collapse of the planet? You know what I mean? Like Mark Fisher said, it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So
yes.
Where's the problem? Is it that we lack the imagination for a better world, or is it that we can't imagine how the world is ending?
I think we can imagine quite well the end of the world because it's so present in culture. I think we might lack imagination of how the world can get better. So often when I have talks to young people, it's kind of difficult. The first time I was just showing them graphs of melting glaciers and animals that were going to go extinct. And it was like it was like I was turning off the lights in their eyes, and I was like, why am I telling them this? And I was thinking, how do you actually frame this to a generation that is in their, 17, 18, 20s? So I basically started to frame it differently in the way that, okay, you're 20 now, and this graph here is to show you how we have to have reached 0 before you reach your 50s. And this is no small industrial revolution. This is no small societal change. But it just means that your whole working life is about this challenge. That is, if you go into fashion design, if I went to fashion design, it was just about fashion. If you go into fashion now, it's 6% of the problem. Fashion waste, the material cycle. So if you go into fashion, it's actually within the frame of higher virtue. There is so much that can be fixed because much of it is only a mindset. It's a cultural thing, but it's also a material thing. So go into fashion and change it. If you go into transportation, when I went into transportation, or my generation, I just want to make a fast Ferrari. Now it's kind of a life and death thing. How can we minimize our impact? How can we continue to travel, but not with all the material and waste that we're currently using? If you go into energy, remaking the energy system is a huge job. And then I tell them, if you go into food, remaking that. If you go into architecture, rethinking how we build buildings. So it's the challenge that the generation is faced with can be faced as gloomy, but it's also a quite interesting challenge in a way.
I couldn't see the time you were showing us, but I feel like we're being very long.
No, it's plenty of time.
What? Plenty of time?
She said.
I think if you guys have any questions, I think it's your time. I apologize for us talking for very long, but does anyone have a question? No one has a question. Are you happy with us talking? You have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. I let's see if I arrive at the question, but I want to share, let's say, an observation and see if it resonates with you, right? In recent years, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a social scientist, and I keep seeing that, let's say, the big Hollywood productions slash big gaming productions, what kind of stories are we offered? What kind of worlds are we offered? And I think it's very often a machine merging with the human. And I don't know, I can think about Matrix and what followed after the Matrix and dozens iterations of how human is merging with the machine. And then I kept thinking, but this comes from LA. It's the American West Coast, right? And then we have the big corporations, the Silicon Valley. And I keep reading the news, but there are so many believers in transhumanism these communities, they go to parties together, they talk to each other. Is it even possible that this might be a scheme? That first, they feed us with culture, with these imaginations, and then the scientists and marketers and product designers, they come to give us those products. We were actually already started craving to have implants in our brains. So I keep thinking, what kind of worlds are we offered through those market and big productions? Why there is no more, harmonious nature culture balance between the planet and the civilizations? And is it just me thinking that we are offered this because it's a good market opportunity? Merge, technology with human tissue?
I mean, I can imagine humans. There's a, I think, school of thought that says that we are we're actually running away from the planet to a virtual world, and it's already happening because we're connected to our phones so much, and we have this virtual avatars. We already live in our virtual iteration of the world, so I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, that's kind of why I was writing this pancake sci-fi. Was actually to reclaim the idea that in the year 2100, it's not about what kind of implant we have, but just what relationship you have to share an old secret with your 20-year-old neighbor or daughter. I wrote a book called Love Star, which is a sci-fi novel. That happened in Iceland, and it was kind of about this ideology: if we don't do it, somebody else will do it. It's about this inevitably that everything seems to be supposed to come forth. So if you can make an implant, it becomes like an inevitability. Like, I was kind of annoyed when they were announcing like the metaverse. Like, it was inevitable that we're gonna move everything into that. I was like, I don't want to move into that. I was also kind of annoyed when the AI thing came in, even though it was philosophically interesting, this disruption, but I was like, I wasn't really in the mood to be disrupted. I felt they were imposing these disruptions upon us. Like that was some kind of a natural cycle of, yeah, you'll just be disrupted. Your industry will be wiped out, or your job, or that's just, like, that was a normal cycle of stealing all your novels, putting them in a database, and pressing enter and making the database write novels from the stolen novels. So I agree, but I don't have an answer. So I just liked your observation. It could be a plot, it's true.
Do we have
to drive us to Mars?
Yes.
Thank you. I really like the thing how you tell us about the stories, that the people don't understand the data and they are not amazed by the data, but they are amazed by stories. And I liked also the comparison, the climate change to the death, that we should not like, I don't know, imagine how it is, but in stories we see death like mostly in our like history, we see it as a skeleton. with a black cloak and sharp scythe or something. So I wonder if you imagined how you could like personify the climate change to actually explain it to younger generation through the stories, and if it's good idea to do it, maybe.
Yeah, I think I wrote the parable, which is called The Story of the Blue Planet. It doesn't actually mention climate change, but it's more about like a parable. So the metaphor that I found that could explain climate change, actually not to children, but more to a general audience, was the origin story in Nordic mythology. So in Nordic mythology, the world started with a frozen cow. So it doesn't make any sense. So first there was nothing, the big void, and then came the frozen cow. And it sounds like a whispering game that went wrong. Like ended up in a manuscript in Iceland after going through continents from somewhere. And the name of the cow is the Ji.hlava of prosperity. And it doesn't make sense either. And Marvel Comics has not made like a blockbuster about the frozen cow yet. So I was thinking about this cow, and how can a frozen cow as a source of life, you know, because frozen is also a symbol of death. You know, something frozen is not a source of life. But if you go to India, then they have this world cow. Her name is Kamadhenu, the symbol of earth. And the foundations of that cow, that is the symbol of earth, is resting upon the Himalayas. And if you go to the Himalayas, you will find the district of Ji.hlava in Nepal, where you can find Mount Kailas, which is the center of the universe. And from there come the 4 major rivers of Asia. And these rivers, of course, come from the glaciers. And one of the most holy origin of the Ganga is a glacier called Gamuk, and that means the mouth of the cow. And I was like, of course, a frozen cow as a source of life, because the glaciers are a perfect system, especially in the Himalayas. They keep the water when it's abundant, and then they release this water generously when it's dry and you need every single drop. So it regulates the water flow, but it's better than water because the glaciers are scraping the bedrock, so the water is actually milky white. And it's better than water because it's full of sediment, and this sediment is finely grained rock that is the best fertilizer that you can get for your crops. So if this water floods over your fields, it just bursts with green after that. And this is the system that's kept the cradle of humanity down there alive for 5,000-6,000 years. And suddenly now we understand that these glaciers are retreating, and many of them will be gone before the end of the century. So mythologically speaking, the cow is dying.
So the climate change is maybe the butcher who's killing the cow.
The climate change is killing the cow,
Yeah.
and I was kind of astonished when I found this comparison, because this something so absurd suddenly just was there. But not only was it there, but it was a symbol of the cow is actually feeding 1 billion people. So when somebody asked me, why did he write this book? I decided to try to be irrational. I said, I got a revelation from the frozen cow. And she said she was in trouble and asked me to tell people about it.
I want to ask one last thing about mythologies, because you said that when you realized the scope of climate change, you realized that this is a mythological thing, a mythological story, something that needs to be done within mythology. And you also mentioned some lakes and some landscapes in Iceland, and the fact that 100 years ago you could say, oh, but you can't touch them because they're holy. And now you can't do that. You have to talk about them within the language of capitalism, I think. And I've never thought about this, but maybe, is it because I can't think of any mythology that's going on like right now that I am or we are experiencing right now, except for Marvel, maybe, like you said.
No, the tech titans in that he was referring to, they're kind of our current mythology. The gods
I'm
of our
thinking.
time.
I'm thinking. My question is, didn't we kind of lose the game when we lose religion because it was telling us, oh, you can say that this lake is holy, and now we don't do it. Now we can't do it. Now there is no mythology. How do we come back to it? If not through inventing a new god, but can we ask Marvel to make some climate change movies?
It's not so easy that I miss religion. We see it down in the Middle East now, what religion can do. So I'm not offering like a solution, but it's more like I'm asking the question, like why can we not say something is holy? You know, not even the Amazon is holy, or not even some of the most beautiful, not the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese in the world is holy. And so if that's not holy, what is? Was that just an illusion, or was because we became so super rational as human beings? But in hindsight, if we had been a bit more irrational and said like, oh, this river is holy and this mountain and these forests here, they're holy, maybe 30%, 40% of nature was holy. If we had been so irrational and superstitious, then we would not be faced with this crisis. So it would have been, in hindsight, more rational to be irrational.
Yeah.
So
did we lose mythology? Is it possible to come back to it and to maybe recreate the holiness of nature through mythology then?
the next time you meet me, I will be in a robe and I will be talking about the frozen cow a bit more. No, with a shaved head. No, I'm not proposing. I don't really know. So I don't really have a solution because, but I think we can be more humble and we can be more cautious and we can be more respectful towards things that are not us. And at least that is something that we can do. But I don't know really what mindset or religion or mythology or beliefs, because I think in a way maybe people were also weaving old wisdom into these stories without actually knowing it. You know, why is this forest holy? Because there's a reason. So maybe we are going into the era of Gaia again, where basically scientists will just go full circle. That is, they split from the church, and then they will just go back in there again and just basically talk about the will of Gaia and please Gaia, bless my report. Maybe such a big crisis will actually end in such a conclusion.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, there's one.
So to continue on those like religious and mythological imaginations, very often like in the history when the big shift was happening, very often new mythologies were actually built very much on the old existing one, because then for people it was much easier to kind of take them, like for example many pagan traditions and then Christianity as an example. And I'm just thinking that, or maybe it's a question, how science can be seen as this religious or mythological entity and how we can build on that. Because when I have conversations with people, a lot of people see science actually as something very accurate and something almost of this kind of religious power. So I'm just curious if now, and the question is also like who is owning the narrative of science and who is like kind of profiting from it. Yeah, so mixed thoughts.
I've met lots of scientists and they feel kind of restricted that in how kind of neutral they have to be, and some of them actually, especially like a generation, I've spoken to scientists in their 60s and 70s, and they present a report about the collapse of the glaciers, and the journalist asks them, what do you feel about this? And they kind of proudly say, I have no feelings about this. I'm just a scientist, I'm just presenting this. I think that's, I've seen this often, more than once and more than twice, at least in Icelandic scientists, that a special generation, and I respect that because science is not supposed to be skewed, or, but it's almost like false neutrality also, because you wouldn't meet a doctor and he would say, I don't care if you have cancer or not, I just see the data that you have cancer, you know, so they have gone further in dehumanizing themselves and furthering themselves from other aspects of what it is to be human in terms of politics, aesthetics, and taking responsibility as citizens, as the citizens that know the field best, by denying themselves of the humanity of feeling for the coral reef, feeling for the fish, feeling for the vegetation, forests, just handing the data to people that actually don't have the deep knowledge, and by detaching themselves in this way, they are also, you could say, they're also kind of dehumanizing these things that they are researching by showing the ability to detach from it. So I think it goes both ways. So many scientists have actually been asking this, you know, can I say love? You know, can I say love in my report? You know, can I put a poem in there that describes better what it means to be in a flock of herring? You know, so can I be human, and what use is it to dehumanize when everything that I am researching is collapsing? And what kind of obligation does that give me as the person that knows this flock of herring, school of herring best? If he is dehumanized, then everybody else that doesn't know it, why should they feel for it? So I've often been in kind of scientific talks, and we've been asking this question actually, and they themselves feel like this restriction that they feel like they have to speak differently, especially because the change is so dramatic, and it's causing them actual pain, but they don't have a language to break out of the rhetorics that they were trained to do. And this also detaches them from the general public, because they can't communicate what they're doing in a proper way.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you for these like rich thoughts on climate crisis and language. And I would like to briefly comment on this idea of the end of the world. It's an idea we have been, like with some people who are also in this room, we have been thinking about a bit these last days, and yeah, like how it's also an idea that is mobilized for maybe all the wrong reasons. And when I'm looking to conservative America, it's an idea that is mobilized for like for certain goals. But then I would also like to point out how maybe it's not just this one end of the world that we're moving towards, but maybe we have to multiply this and think of many worlds that have already ended and that are maybe ending right now in this moment where we're sitting here. To illustrate this, like we had some inputs about the ocean today, and maybe a coral reef, it's already a very rich world and coral reefs have been dying. And then another example would be yeah, many maybe indigenous worlds with their own relations, with their own languages, with their own ways of relating to the environment, they have been and they are constantly erased, kind of, and so maybe the question can go in a direction of like a multiplicity of perspectives and maybe also maybe shrinking our this kind of world, this big world that we're constantly trying to keep alive.
I also think that, like I showed you the graph of ocean acidification, we have like multiple documents that each and every one of them is big enough to be a paradigm shift in itself. If only the ocean was acidifying, if only the coral reefs were dying, if only the ocean level was rising, if only the glaciers were melting, if only the ice cap was disappearing. So all these multiple kind of events, each and every one of them is enough to be a paradigm shift, to change everything. So when I'm writing the book, I'm also asking, like, aware that the discourse of today, like I was talking about this economic discourse or something, the discourse of today, like what I write as normal in the book, in the context of the book, might be seen in a different light after 100 years, like when a new language has emerged or a new paradigm. So I was thinking, like, maybe I'm writing the book like a well-intended slave owner, you know.
Yeah.
You know, well, maybe I'm just saying, well, I try to treat my slaves well. I give them nutritious food. I weigh them every day, and they can sing songs on Saturdays. So, you know, I'm a good person. But and I consider myself sincerely a good person in the context of the norm of society. But then after 100 years, somebody reads this and it's like, this is
You're
this
disgusting.
This is so disgusting, you know. And so that's what I'm feeling like when I'm writing the book, is that we're in a language and a norm transition, and I'm part maybe of a system that might not be seen in a favorable way after 100 years. But I don't know if that will go into a good or bad direction, because I also am afraid that if you create climate alarmism, and if you say 100 million people will be sailing over the Mediterranean, that will not bring out the best in us. It will rather maybe go into far-right parties and military rather than solar panels.
I just wanted to say that when you say that stories are good for us because they can, you know, translate what the scientists are trying to say, they have this disadvantage because all the other people who disagree with climate change can also tell their stories, and they can just, you know, even it out. They can say, yes, but there's my story, which talks about, there's this book from our former president called, I don't know, Blue Planet, yes. And it's a story that goes against yours. Okay. You know what I mean? So there's a whole industry of stories that can always even out what you say. So that's the problem with stories, I think. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something controversial, and that's hope. Because there's this quote from Max Planck that said that this generation is just going to die and not understand the new norms. But the younger generation is just going to be okay with it because they grew up with it. That sounds really hopeful, but the planet is still collapsing. But is there hope for you? Is there anything that gives you hope?
Well, I think I must have hope because I wrote the book. Because if I didn't have hope, then I would probably not have made the effort. I think also if I had a 1% chance of living a disease, I would also aim for that 1%. So when people ask me, do you have hope? I say, yes, I have hope. But that doesn't mean that there is hope. It's just, I think there's hope. You get kind of disappointed, or not kind of disappointed, you get very gloomy when you see Ukraine and now Israel. It's like, you know, are we is this just the cycle that will go on forever? And but I do believe still that it's of course stupid to talk about the young generation is going to, but I do think there is a shift, and I do think it's a sincerely, I think the generation that is now entering the universities, they do have a different relationship to this century than we have. Also because you're talking about death, I think more than ever, my generation or our generation is in age denial. And we haven't even admitted that the 20th century is almost 1/4 in. We haven't even given a label to the first 10 and 20 years. It's just all 2000 something. Because if we give it labels of decades, then we will feel old, and we don't want to be old. So I can talk about music in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but then everything after 2000 is just one muck of yesterday. We can't even define the century into time zones. And I think it's because if we admit that, then it means we're old. And now a generation is coming in that is born after 2000, and they're not with this imaginary helmet of the future, the year 2000 on their heads. And they are actually going to live the whole century. And I think they will take the data much more seriously. But again, if it goes into a positive or destructive direction, I just have to do my best to push it into the positive direction.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here with us and asking really, really beautiful questions. And that's it. This is the end. This is the end. And hopefully, is it? Not the end.
Takk fyrir.
Thank you so much.